War creates enemies. It draws lines across maps, across battlefields, across human hearts. Young men are taught to see each other not as individuals, but as threats to be eliminated. But what happens when those same enemies meet again, decades later, no longer as soldiers, but as men haunted by the same nightmares? How war brought enemies together. This is the story of men who tried to kill each other in World War II and who later became the closest of friends. Act 1. The Warrior's Story. 1. The Tank Gunner and the Machine Gunner. March 2013. Cologne, Germany. An 88-year-old American veteran named Buck Marsh stands before the cathedral, scanning the crowd. He's searching for a man named Gustav Schaefer, a German soldier he'd tried to kill 68 years earlier. In 1945, Buck Marsh was a tank gunner with the 3rd Armored Division when they rumbled into Cologne, a city reduced to rubble. From his position, he spotted a German machine gun nest. Green tracers streamed toward his unit. Buck made a split-second decision. He fired. The building collapsed. But decades later, Buck would discover something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Among the rubble was a civilian, a 26-year-old woman named Katharina Esser. Friends called her Kathy. She worked at a grocery store. Her boss had been driving her to safety when Buck's shell hit. I saw her face on the television, in footage I didn't even know existed, and suddenly this war I'd put behind me came rushing back. I couldn't sleep. I was afraid of the dark at 80 years old. I had to know, did I fire that shot? Or was it someone else? Buck obtained the original uncut footage from the National Archives. He watched it in slow motion, tracking every movement, hoping to find proof that someone else had fired the fatal shot. But there was only one person who might know the truth, the German gunner whose nest he'd destroyed, the man who'd fired those green tracers. With the help of a journalist friend, Buck discovered that Gustav Schaefer had survived. And now, in 2013, they would meet for the first time as old men. When Gustav and Buck finally stood face to face, they were no longer enemies. They were two men bound by the same terrible memory, each haunted by what they'd done and seen. We both carried the same war in our hearts, the same nightmares. When we met, we understood each other in a way no one else could. They talked for hours. They shared their memories of that day, the chaos, the fear, the sounds. And slowly, Buck began to find something he'd been searching for, not absolution, but understanding. Two men who'd been trained to hate each other discovered they were remarkably alike. Gustav has since passed away. But every year on March 6th, the day they truly became friends, Buck arranges for 2 yellow roses to be placed on Kathy Esser's grave, one from each of them. Some things, Buck says, must be remembered. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Léon Gautier was 21 years old when he stormed Sword Beach as part of the French commandos, one of 177 men under British command who faced a wall of German machine gun fire. Archival footage, D-Day landings, soldiers wading through water under fire. Narrator. Behind the German guns was Heinrich Börner, a young Wehrmacht soldier desperately trying to stop the Allied advance. Heinrich Börner fought in those same hedgerows, what the Germans called the bocage. He remembers the same things Léon does, the horrible smell of rotting corpses, friend and foe alike, the mosquitoes buzzing amid enemy voices just meters away, the small sour green apples they tried to eat, the shrubberies so thick that tanks became trapped and snipers found perfect cover. On July 17th, Heinrich's unit was forced to retreat. They became trapped in what he calls the most horrible memory of his life, the Battle of the Falaise Pocket. Completely surrounded by Allied forces, with dead bodies seemingly everywhere. Of his company's 120 men, only 9 survived. Heinrich became a prisoner of war, forced into farm labor until 1947. When he was released, his hometown of Leipzig was in ruins and under Soviet control. He decided to stay in Normandy, in the very place where he'd once fought against the French. Leon, meanwhile, continued to serve in deployments across Britain, France, and even Cameroon before settling down as a claims adjuster in Normandy. 70 years after they tried to kill each other, Leon and Heinrich discovered they were neighbors in the same French town. They met by chance at a local veterans event. At first, there was tension, but then they began to talk. They realized they'd been in the same place at the same time, just on opposite sides of the barbed wire. We both agreed. Fighting like World War II should never happen again. The idea of young men taking up guns and shooting at each other is horribly impossible to us now. Narrator. They became close friends, meeting regularly, sharing memories that only they could understand. Two men who'd survived the same hell, finding comfort in each other's company. Don Malarkey was a sergeant in Easy Company, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, the legendary unit later immortalized in the HBO series Band of Brothers. He jumped into Normandy on D-Day, fought through France, endured the siege of Bastogne, and participated in the capture of Hitler's Eagle's Nest. Malarkey killed enemy soldiers. It was his job. He was good at it. And for decades afterward, he carried the weight of those deaths. Across the Atlantic, in a remote German village, lived Engelbert Engels, a Wehrmacht soldier who'd fought in the Battle of the Bulge on the opposite side. Unlike Malarkey, Engelbert never killed an enemy soldier, but he spent decades racked with guilt over his participation in the Nazi war effort, over what his country had done, what he'd been part of, even if he'd never pulled a trigger. On the 60th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, these two men met. Malarkey was a celebrity by then, featured in Band of Brothers. Engelbert had passed the years in obscurity, but both men carried the same shackled ball and chain, the psychological wounds of war that had haunted them for their entire adult lives. I never talked much about what we did. People would see Band of Brothers and think they understood, but they didn't. Nobody could, unless they'd been there. Engelbert Engels. I knew what my country had done. I knew about the camps, the atrocities. Even though I never killed anyone, I was part of it. That guilt never goes away. When they met, something remarkable happened. Here were two men who'd been on opposite sides of history's greatest conflict, one a victor, one among the defeated, one celebrated, one forgotten. But they shared something more powerful than their differences, the same nightmares, the same survivor's guilt, the same inability to fully explain their experiences to anyone who hadn't been there. They could give each other something no one else could, understanding without judgment, compassion without pity, recognition without celebration. They began corresponding regularly. They called each other. They met again. And slowly, they found that by helping each other process their trauma, they were finally able to save themselves. In their 80s, they found the redemption that had eluded them for decades, not through forgetting, but through sharing their burden with someone who truly understood.
Sometimes fate, or perhaps divine providence, operates in the most ordinary circumstances.